call came when I least expected it. A phone call at 3 in the morning, a black car at my door in less than 20 minutes. Urgent and confidential, they said. Nothing I hadn't heard before in my 15 years serving as a specialist diver in the US Navy's rescue operations. But something in my immediate superior's tone told me this mission would be different. When we arrived at the Pentagon, I was led through a series of corridors I had never walked before, into a basement room that seemed to have been set up specifically for this meeting. The long conference table was occupied by figures who rarely found themselves in the same room. 3 high-ranking admirals, scientists with top security clearance badges, State Department representatives, and even a man in a suit who did not introduce himself, but whose air of authority suggested some intelligence agency. "Harker, welcome." Admiral Collins stood to greet me. I knew him by reputation, a pragmatic man with ambitious vision, responsible for some of the Navy's most innovative projects in recent decades. "Take a seat. What we discuss here does not leave this room." On the main screen, an image appeared that everyone would recognize. The Titanic, lying at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, its ghostly structure partially covered by sediment and marine organisms. An image I had seen hundreds of times in documentaries, books, and even in training simulations, but never in a military context. "Ladies and gentlemen," Collins began, "we are here to discuss Project Lazarus." The name was an obvious biblical reference, bringing back something that was dead. "The administration has approved the most ambitious naval salvage operation in history. We are going to recover the Titanic." The silence that followed was broken by murmurs of disbelief. Even I couldn't help but let out a skeptical smile. It was impossible. The ship was nearly 4,000 meters deep, broken in two, and its structure had been weakened by over 100 years of marine corrosion. "I know what you're thinking," Collins continued, "but over the past 3 years, we have developed technology that makes this possible." He gestured, and a middle-aged woman with graying hair tied in a tight bun took the floor. "Dr. Stella Chen, Chief Oceanographer of the project." She introduced herself, adjusting her rectangular glasses. "We have developed a modular lifting system using high-strength polymers and controllable flotation bags. The idea is not to lift the Titanic as a single piece, but in carefully cut and preserved sections, which will then be reassembled in a massive naval pavilion in Norfolk." The lights dimmed, and a 3D animation showed the process in impressive technical detail. It was bold, expensive, technically challenging, and yet it seemed plausible. The presentation continued for nearly an hour, with specialists in different fields explaining their roles in the plan. When they finally turned to me, I understood why I was there. "Harker, we need your expertise," Collins said, handing me a classified file with the Project Lazarus emblem on the cover, a silhouette of the Titanic emerging from the waters. "This is an opportunity that will change the history of naval engineering." I opened the file and was met with disturbing images. An ROV, remotely operated vehicle, destroyed. The ROV-7, our most advanced underwater robot, had been completely shredded during an initial exploration inside the ship. "What happened here?" I asked, examining the photos of the wrecked equipment. Dr. Stella sighed. "It was our first attempt at detailed mapping of the internal corridors. We wanted to assess the structural integrity before planning the cuts. The last transmitted images showed only a quick blur before total signal loss. Probably a short circuit or structural failure," she continued, as we reviewed the footage frame by frame on a secondary screen. "With the ship's age and the pressure at that depth, it wouldn't be surprising if some structure suddenly gave way." But there was something in her eyes that didn't match that explanation. A confident scientist doesn't avert their gaze when presenting a hypothesis. Collins got straight to the point. "We want a human team down there. People who can assess the situation in real time, make decisions, understand what happened to the ROV, and determine whether the project is viable or not. With all due respect, sir, why risk human lives when we could send another ROV? We already have. 2 other ROVs failed in different areas of the ship. We need human eyes down there, Harker." In the following days, I was introduced to the team I would be leading. Jensen, a Norwegian naval engineer with 3 PhDs and experience in salvaging underwater structures under extreme conditions. Patel, an Indian marine biologist specializing in deep-water ecosystems formed around artificial wrecks. Rodriguez, a Mexican structural technician with a background in the oil industry, capable of assessing the integrity of virtually any material under pressure. And Wallace, another experienced diver like me, with whom I had worked on 2 previous missions. The best in their fields. All capable of operating at extreme depths with the new pressurized suits developed specifically for Project Lazarus. All excited about the historic significance of the mission, and the substantial government bonuses promised. "It's not just the bonuses, Harker," Wallace said during a break in our intensive 2-week training. "Think about the history we're going to make. Our names will be in the books alongside those who discovered the ship in the first place." I smiled, but something bothered me. During the preparation sessions, details about the ROV incident were downplayed. Every time we asked more specific questions, we received vague responses. "Focus on the structural assessment," Dr. Stella kept repeating. "If you determine the salvage is viable, Phase 2 of the project will begin immediately." On the eve of the mission, we reviewed the action plan once more. Descent in the special submersible, approach to the ship, entry in pairs through previously mapped access points, detailed assessment of critical areas, with special emphasis on the grand staircase and the cargo hold, where the first ROV had been destroyed. "Any questions?" Collins asked in the final briefing, looking each of us in the eye. I hesitated for a moment, then asked, "The real footage from the ROV, can we see it before we go down?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Collins exchanged glances with Dr. Stella. "The footage has been thoroughly analyzed by the technical team," he finally replied. "The official conclusion is mechanical failure followed by implosion due to pressure. Nothing that should concern you, as long as your equipment functions properly." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling of my quarters, thinking about something my instructor had told me years ago. In deep waters, there are no small problems. I felt like we were being sent in partially blind, but the mission was too big, too important to back out now. At 04 hours, we boarded the specially modified support vessel. As we pulled away from the coast, I looked at my team. They were the best, well-trained, confident, all expendable, as I would later discover, a bitter realization that came too late for 3 of them. The descent is always the most contemplative moment for any diver. As our submersible moved deeper into the growing darkness, I felt that familiar sensation of isolation, like we were leaving behind not just the surface, but all of humanity. Jensen continuously monitored the sonar data, while Patel took notes on the occasional forms of life that crossed the vehicle's external lights. "We're approaching 3,000 meters, Rodriguez reported over the intercom, monitoring our descent. External temperature, 2 degrees Celsius, pressure within expected parameters." Wallace adjusted himself beside me, checking his diving equipment for the 3rd time. It was a ritual we all shared, a final compulsive check before facing one of the most hostile environments on the planet. "What do you think it'll be like?" he asked, his voice low as if afraid the others would hear. "Seeing the Titanic in person, I mean. Not just images or simulations." "Probably more impressive and more depressing at the same time," I replied, adjusting my own gear. That's when the submersible's external lights finally caught it. At first, just a distant outline, a shape denser than the surrounding darkness. Then, as we got closer, the Titanic emerged like a ghost, its bow appearing first, followed by the main deck and the partially collapsed upper structures. "My God," Patel whispered, momentarily abandoning her scientific professionalism. "It's magnificent." And it was. Despite the deterioration, despite the obvious destruction caused by both the sinking and the years submerged, the ship's majesty was undeniable. Decades on the ocean floor had created a strange ecosystem around the wreck. The light revealed deep-sea corals growing in orange nodules along the metal structures. Anemones swayed gently, anchored to horizontal surfaces. Deep-sea fish, some nearly translucent, others with bizarre adaptations for life in the darkness, swam slowly through openings and around the fallen masts. Impressive biodiversity, Patel observed, recovering from her initial awe and returning to her scientific perspective. Microorganisms have probably accelerated the decomposition of organic structures, but these coral colonies seem to have created a stable environment. We carefully circled the ship, observing the extent of the damage and recording areas that appeared structurally compromised. The plan was to dock the submersible near an opening in the hull that had been previously mapped, allowing us direct access to the interior. Equipment checked, pressure stabilized, communications functional, I reported over the radio to the support vessel nearly 4 kilometers above us. Beginning internal exploration. Our mission was strategically divided. Wallace and I would form the first team, exploring the lower corridors and the cargo hold. Patel and Jensen would be the second team, assessing the main halls and the famous grand staircase. Rodriguez would remain in the submersible, monitoring our communications and vitals, ready to coordinate an emergency evacuation if necessary. As we prepared to exit, Rodriguez gave us the final instructions. Remember, you have 4 hours of oxygen, but I want everyone back in 3. Maintain constant communication. Report any structural anomalies immediately. And please, don't touch anything that looks unstable. We exited the submersible in pairs. The feeling of floating right next to the Titanic's hull was indescribable, a mix of historical reverence and professional apprehension. Even Wallace, usually playful before any operation, was silent as we swam toward the opening in the hull. Inside, the Titanic was a dark labyrinth of narrow corridors, rusted staircases, and partially collapsed rooms. Our flashlights illuminated personal belongings abandoned more than a century ago. "Something's wrong here," Wallace whispered through the communicator after about 20 minutes of exploration. "The fish. Did you notice how they completely disappeared once we came inside?" He was right. Where were the small life forms that would normally colonize these spaces? It was as if even the sea creatures knew to stay away. "Strange," I agreed, noting the observation in our log. "Maybe something about the internal materials, or weaker currents inside?" We continued our exploration methodically. We recorded the condition of the walls, assessed the feasibility of structural cuts in specific locations, and mapped potential access routes for future teams. The whole time, that unsettling absence of marine life persisted, a silence that seemed to grow as we ventured deeper into the ship. "Base, we're approaching the location where we lost the ROV," I reported as we reached the 2-hour mark of our exploration. "Nothing unusual so far, just..." That was when we heard the scream, a terrible sound, distorted by the communication system, but unmistakably human, coming from the sector where Patel and Jensen were exploring. "Jensen! Patel! Respond!" I shouted into the communicator, feeling my heart rate spike instantly. Silence, then static, and then Rodriguez's tense voice from the submersible. "Harker, I'm picking up abnormal readings. I lost Jensen's vital signs. Patel is moving fast. Her heart rate is skyrocketing." Wallace and I locked eyes through the visors of our helmets. Without a word, we started swimming rapidly toward our colleague's last known location, guided by the digital maps on our displays. "Patel, respond! What's your status?" I kept calling out as we advanced through increasingly deteriorated corridors, our equipment lighting up the dense darkness ahead. No, it's not possible." Patel's broken voice finally came through, barely audible beneath layers of interference. "Too big. Hurry." That was when I saw, for a brief moment, something my brain refused to process. A long, monstrous shape, the size of a school bus, gliding through a side corridor. A moray eel. But it was impossible. No known moray grows that large. The creature had the characteristic shape, the pronounced jaw, the exposed teeth, even with its mouth closed, but its proportions were utterly absurd. "Wallace, did you see that?" I asked, but he was already moving forward, weapon in hand, the pressurized rifle that was part of our standard gear, theoretically capable of repelling medium-sized sharks. "Base, we have a situation here," I reported, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rising terror. "Possible large predator, very large. Requesting..." My words were cut off by what happened next. The corridor ahead of me exploded with movement. The creature emerged from the darkness in a blur, its cavernous mouth opening to reveal rows of dagger-like teeth, twice the size they should have been. Wallace fired 3 times in quick succession, but it was like shooting a water pistol at a tank. The projectiles barely registered on the massive creature, which advanced like a runaway locomotive. I watched as Wallace's body was swallowed in seconds, his form vanishing between the monstrous jaws like a mere crumb. The water around me turned red, a dark cloud expanding at a terrifying speed. I turned and began swimming desperately through the corridors, guided only by the digital map on my visor and my primal survival instinct. I heard Rodriguez shouting over the communicator about immediate evacuation, about how Patel's signal had also been lost, about how I needed to return to the submersible immediately. The creature was chasing me. I could feel its massive presence behind me, hear the water shifting, sense the pressure changing with each movement of that evolutionary nightmare. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. An undiscovered species? A mutation? Something that had found the Titanic a perfect habitat, isolated and rich in iron? I reached a room I immediately recognized as the old engine room, its controls fossilized by a century of exposure to salt water. Ancient electrical equipment, useless generators, control panels covered in marine incrustations. That's when I had the idea. Desperate, but the only one that seemed to offer any chance. That creature was a fish, after all. And fish have fundamental vulnerabilities, even ones of impossible proportions. I worked frantically, my fingers trembling inside the special gloves as I connected my backup battery to the old metal conductors still running through the room. Basic physics doesn't change, even 4,000 meters deep. Metal conducts electricity. Water conducts electricity. Fish are sensitive to electric fields. The moray eel was approaching. I could see its monstrous silhouette at the entrance of the room, its sinuous body completely filling the doorway. Its eyes, those aberrant eyes, far too large, with a cold intelligence no fish should possess, locked onto me. I had only seconds. As it lunged at me in an explosive movement, I activated the improvised system. The electric discharge illuminated the water around us, a blinding bluish flash that turned the ship's interior into a strange artificial daylight for a brief moment. The creature convulsed violently, its massive body twisting as if it were being turned inside out before retreating into the darkness with such force that it created a current that nearly ripped me from my position. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I swam like I had never swum before, ignoring the low oxygen alarms blaring in my equipment, following the most direct path back to the submersible. Every corridor seemed longer, every doorway narrower, every second an eternity. When I finally reached the submersible, Rodriguez yanked me inside with a strength born of panic, sealing the hatch mere seconds before something enormous slammed into our hull, making the entire vehicle tremble as if it had been struck by an underwater avalanche. "Start the engines, now!" I shouted, collapsing onto the metallic floor as I struggled to catch my breath. Rodriguez didn't need a second order. The submersible roared to life with a rising hum, its exterior lights revealing for one fleeting instant a massive eye staring at us through the hatch. An eye that belonged to no creature cataloged by science, an eye that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. As we left the Titanic behind, abandoning the bodies of our colleagues and that evolutionary aberration that had found refuge in the iron depths of the most famous ship in history, a chilling certainty took shape in my mind. Some things were meant to remain buried in the depths of the ocean, and the Titanic, it seemed, had become the domain of one of them. When we finally broke the surface, the sky was gray. The rescue team met us with confused expressions as they saw only 2 of us emerging from the hatch. The news of the loss of 3 crew members spread quickly across the deck, turning anticipation into horror. Admiral Collins was waiting in the ship's command center, his face an impenetrable mask of military control as I reported what had happened. "A giant moray eel?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "The size of a school bus?" "I know how it sounds, sir," I replied, still trembling despite the thermal blanket draped over my shoulders. "But I saw what I saw. Rodriguez can confirm the impact against the submersible." Rodriguez nodded slowly, but I noticed his hesitation. "Something big hit us. That's a fact. As for the exact size or species, visibility was limited. I caught the exchanged glances between Collins and Dr. Stella, that same silent communication they had shared before the mission. I was beginning to understand. They knew. Maybe not exactly what it was, but they knew there was something dangerous down there. The bodies of the other divers were probably carried away by the current, Dr. Stella said. Or perhaps a shark entered the wreck. Many abyssal species remain poorly documented. A shark? I repeated incredulously. No shark moves like that. No shark has that shape, those teeth. It was a moray eel, a moray of monstrous proportions. Harker, you've been through a traumatic experience, a doctor interjected. One I hadn't even noticed was in the room. Deep-water perceptual dissonance is a well-documented phenomenon. Examine my gear, I interrupted, my voice rising. My tank has bite marks. Analyze them. Compare them with known records. They did, eventually. The marks were photographed, measured, compared to marine species databases. The final report, delivered 3 weeks later, concluded that the marks do not match any cataloged species, but likely resulted from multiple impacts with wreckage debris during the emergency evacuation. Convenient. Perfectly convenient. Project Lazarus was officially canceled 23 days after our mission, citing unforeseen structural risks and compromised technical feasibility as the official reasons. The families of Jensen, Patel, and Wallace received generous compensations and vague condolences. Their bodies were never recovered, of course. They never could be. I was removed from active service, initially placed on medical leave for psychological recovery, then discreetly reassigned to administrative duties. Rodriguez was sent to a base in the Pacific, about as far from the North Atlantic as possible without leaving the hemisphere. The message was clear. Forget what happened down there. But I couldn't forget. The scars on my body, 3 deep gashes on my left leg where the creature had nearly caught me during the escape, were constant physical reminders. The nightmares were worse. Those disproportionate eyes staring at me. That cavernous mouth swallowing Wallace as if he were nothing. I started researching on my own, using my contacts and remaining access to piece things together. I discovered that, over the years, multiple expeditions to the Titanic had reported anomalies. Equipment inexplicably destroyed, recordings lost, even a small tourist submersible that simply vanished in 2009. An incident quickly hushed up and attributed to human error. I reached out to a marine biologist who had studied abyssal ecosystems around shipwrecks. We met in a discreet bar in Norfolk, where he spoke in hushed tones about unpublished theories. The environment around large metal wrecks can create unique conditions, he explained, his eyes constantly scanning for anyone listening. Currents induced by thermal gradients, mineral concentrations, even small electromagnetic fields generated by corrosion. All of these can influence local evolution in unpredictable ways. You're saying that thing could have evolved down there? I'm saying we don't know what's happening in the depths. 95% of the ocean remains unexplored. Large wrecks like the Titanic form habitat islands in an abyssal desert. What could adapt and thrive under those conditions? He emptied his glass of whiskey. There are rumors, other divers, other teams, stories that never make the news. I never dived professionally again. I turned down every offer, including a particularly generous one from National Geographic to document abyssal habitats. The ocean and I had reached a silent understanding. I would remain on the surface for the rest of my life. Occasionally, when the weather is particularly bad and the sea crashes furiously against the shore near my home in New England, I think of the Titanic, resting in its oceanic grave, guarded by its monstrous sentinel. I think of the confidential reports that were likely drafted after our expedition, the plans that were permanently shelved, the truths that will never reach the public. One thing is certain. Some things should remain at the bottom of the ocean. The Titanic has found its final resting place, and now it has a guardian ensuring it stays that way. And I know that down there, in the impenetrable depths of the North Atlantic, among the twisted remains of what was once called the Ship of Dreams, something swims through the darkness, something ancient and horrifying at the same time, something that reminds us that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, the ocean will never truly be ours.